Hello. Today's topic, we're going to look at coordinated movement. So this is going to be an extension of looking at steering behaviors. We're now going to consider other ways that agents can work with amongst other agents. So beyond just avoiding other agents in a very sort of independent strategy like we saw before with the open steer examples especially. So now we're going to have scenarios where we have agents that are moving in some level of coordination, and there's different levels of coordination which we will check out. So this is somewhat more difficult than where you just have an NPC, a single agent. So there's different sorts of issues that we will run into that get complicated once you do have this coordination involved. So certainly there's the shuffling around of these agents in like close quarters. But what if there's an obstacle in the way? So we've talked a little bit about what to do, both in terms of steering behaviors and path planning for the single agent scenario. But what happens when you've now got a big group? How can you actually coordinate that so that the movement is efficient, but also we have like computational cost issues to be concerned about. If you've got a large group, say 20 agents, they're all meant to work together and move together, and some unexpected obstacle pops up. Are all of them doing path planning? Not to mention just basic movement. Are they all? Do they all independently come up with plans that are coordinated, or do we have some more like top-down sort of approach where maybe just look for minimizing computation by doing one path planning operation and then somehow leveraging that single calculation across multiple agents. And there's different ways that we can have agents, this level of coordination defined. We could have just some loose notion of a group, or it could be something very precise like a military formation where each unit has a very specific place to go, or perhaps a marching band. It's very different than if you just have a group that's all working together, all going the same place. So group behaviors are certainly valuable in games. There's some of the simplest sorts of group behaviors have been useful for more of like a background sort of animations. So we've seen, we've talked a little bit about Boids already. We're actually going to look much closer today. But like a school of fish or a flock of birds, that would be something that could have some aesthetic appeal, extra just sort of natural animation and world interaction that you could add to a game. There's also situations like, let's say, Grand Theft Auto. You have all of the pedestrians walking on the sidewalks and around the urban areas, and so those are the sorts of things that would be nice to pull off. And we've seen a little bit of how that can work. For instance, with steering behaviors, we can have a wandering sort of behavior. We could randomly generate path planning, go from just wherever the agent is, go to some random path. These sorts of things could add just some appeal to the game. Now, there's also, as we'll see, other types of group behaviors can be useful more for specific gameplay, especially as you transition to formations. This is especially true of strategy games, so like a real-time strategy game. You will be interacting with various units under your command, And in some cases, you might be selecting like a large group and asking them to move from their current location to a new location. You might have the desire to have more tight control over how they move and maintaining formations or certain rules about their movement. And so you can have those sorts of issues with gameplay as well. And then this can also apply to agents that are like enemies of the player. So providing some sort of challenge, and you want to have some degree of intelligence, or at least the appearance of some intelligence in your enemies, especially like large groups or like a horde of zombies. How should the zombies move towards and attack the player? And then what if you have more intelligent sort of enemies? And then how do you get those to work? So if we were to think of leveraging our what we've learned so far with steering behaviors, we might think about ways that we could leverage just those core concepts of moving to a position or away from a position, and maybe we could blend those concepts together to allow agents to go towards a common position amongst a group. Maybe we define a group location, and so the agents would all move towards the whatever this group location is, or grouping location. But then we also don't want them to get too close to one another so that they're all just one on top of another. Maybe we want to simultaneously maintain some separation. And so you could imagine also using like an obstacle avoidance type of a strategy and blend that with these other forces. And maybe we could further layer together just this core notion of steering behaviors, the fundamental sort of steering behaviors by doing the weighted average sort of blending approach. Next up, I want to show a little video where the presenters are going to, I'm not going to show the entire video, but we're going to jump to a point in the video where they talk about these enemies attacking the player and various issues that had to be addressed in terms of the design. And so we'll see both like tracking the player, but I believe also I think in this video it also has some issues related to path planning involving the large group as well. So I think this is kind of a good point to maybe jump ahead to a little bit more of a complex scenario. Then we'll step back a bit again as we move forward, just to kind of give you an idea of the situation like a practical sort of situation for like developing a game. Once I start this, I'll just be quiet and at least play part of the presentation here. Switch that.
Hang out.
Sorry, I'm not getting the play cursor. Let me see if I can jump to a point. There we go.
So now we were at the point where our AI could chase the player, but it wasn't enough. As you can see, they tend to kind of clump up, or in other cases, they'll conga line once they've been chasing the player for just a little while. So while they're technically fulfilling their purpose of chase the player around and hit him, our AI is still the root of boring, repetitive gameplay. We need to get the base OD to spread out. This will make our combat more dynamic and challenging, and it will make our enemies feel more lethal and intelligent. We started trying to solve this problem using a technique from our Ratchet and Clank games called arc angles. An enemy approaching the player with an arc angle of 0 will run straight at him, while one approaching with an arc angle of theta will take the top path, negative theta being the bottom path. All of these arc angles are managed by a flanking manager that exists on the player. It assigns out angles to approach to each of the base OD so that we don't have all of our enemies trying to approach from the same direction. And this actually works really great when we're near the player. Here you can see the same mob of base OD using arc angles. You'll notice that they immediately begin to spread out, and I have to do a lot more work to avoid being hit. At a low level, arc angles work by changing the position that an AI is trying to nav to. As the base OD or the player moves, we recalculate the position along the arc angle and try and go there. In order to prevent arc angles from potentially sending a character to the wrong side of a wall, we require that a line from the target, the player's position, to the arc angle position be unobstructed on NavMesh. In practice, this means that because our levels aren't flat, empty planes like this, the arc angle destination is usually within about 5 to 10 meters of the player. And this has the unfortunate effect that groups of enemies that are far away from their target will have their paths only vary over the last couple of segments. We needed to find other solutions for getting base OD to spread out when they were far from their target. Our first idea was to go in and make all of the polys involved in nav path queries more expensive so that subsequent path queries by other characters would be likely to find an alternate route. Now, this didn't work. As you can see here, the size and shape of nav polys doesn't necessarily correspond to features in the world. Right here, we've just got a bunch of polys coming together in the middle of the road. And here we've got this thin sliver of a triangle sandwiched between two large triangles. This inconsistency can cause weird things to happen. Say we have one character move along this path, and this would add cost to these polys. This will sometimes have very little effect on a path starting at a nearby position, which isn't great. Worse off, if we move both of the path start and end points down just a little, well, then this becomes the lowest cost path. What we needed to find were ways to add cost in places that didn't have awkward knock-on effects like this. One further problem that we had with directly weighting the NavMesh that I feel is worth mentioning is that we were unable to figure out a good way to efficiently store, utilize, and access all of this data. We have an 8-player multiplayer mode, and we have some very large multi-faction, multi-target fights. Instead of that, the first thing we did was added costs to individual nav clues. Here you'll see a bunch of characters trying to get from one side of the fence to the other. And you'll see purple lines begin to stack up as the nav clue's cost gets changed. As you've seen before, our world's incredibly dense with nav clues, and so this makes adding weight to them meaningful. Additionally, since they correspond to actual visible geometry and are usually near the edge of, or near the boundaries of NavMesh, they don't cause the other awkward problems that adding weight to nav polys does. Seeing one character jump over a car while another runs around it isn't a particularly awkward thing. Basically, if a bot gets a path that goes through a nav clue, he'll increase the cost of using that clue so that subsequent path queries are likely to find another path. As an additional layer, bots who get near a clue that is already in use will try to immediately find an alternate path. This is what causes the cost to kind of go up and down here in this video. Adding cost to nav clues combined with arc angles still wasn't quite enough because there were still times where an AI could get a path that went for a long distance without going through any nav clues. And so enter what we called influence spheres. These are something that our engine group gave us, and it's basically the ability to bundle a bunch of spheres along with a path query and associated costs. Here you can see 4 such spheres drawn in red. And as an example, the one on the bottom sphere will make crossing that area more expensive, but only for one particular path query. And the way we utilize these is that when each base OD asks for a path, which is fairly frequently, he will ask the flanking manager that I mentioned before, the guy who manages all of the arc angles, and it will actually look at all of the paths that all of the base OD targeting a single player are using and look for common close bend points. And it will then place these influence spheres on those bend points to try and force the guys to find an alternate route. This works well because path bend points will correspond with features of the geometry. If they didn't, then path smoothing would have removed them. We also try and keep the size of these influence spheres relatively small so that if they don't result in a substantively different path, smoothing will be able to kind of iron things out, and it won't look like the character is just running around empty space. So around this point, we felt like we had done a lot to the base OD to make them dangerous and fun when the player is close to the ground. They spread out, they surround you, and they do a pretty good job of killing you. And this really encourages our core gameplay. However, if you get up high, it's kind of trivially easy to just move back and forth and murder them without any resistance. And while they're supposed to be vulnerable to traversal, at this point, it just felt like traversal was a win button, and the game was quickly becoming boring. So our AI was still causing problems, and our last goal was to get the base OD to occasionally become a threat to a player who is traversing well. This isn't something that we needed to have happen all the time, but it's something that we needed to avoid the player going into kind of autopilot. So our proposed solution was to try and get base OD perched up on individual traversal pieces that the player is probably going to use. If the player happens to get too close to the individual guy, the guy will try and hit the player. In order to figure out what traversal to use, we actually collect all pieces of traversal near the player and then score them on a number of factors. Every time the player is used, or every time the player uses a given piece of traversal, we make it tastier. And this is very important because the key thing that we're trying to encourage is the player to sort of keep up their forward momentum and movement. We don't want them to be able to use the same grind or bouncy over and over. The second is that we predict using Dead Reckoning the area that the player will be in for about the next second or so and make traversal in that area more attractive. Finally, we factor in how close each individual base OD is to each piece of traversal. Here you'll see that as I traverse up onto wires, there'll be a bunch of boxes that appear. These are potential places for base OD to wait for me. Base OD can wait on bouncies, they can perch on top of grinds, or they can hang from grinds. The lines going down to the ground correspond to nav and collision tests that we use to validate jump-up positions. We also restrict them so that no more than 25% of the group can be waiting on traversal at any one time. I also feel that it's worth mentioning that we turn on this ability as well as many other base OD abilities gradually from the beginning of the game. At the beginning of the game, they never get on traversal, don't lunge at the player, and are much nicer in order to sort of ease the player into our frenetic mechanics. I think it's worth putting it all together and taking a look at how all of these systems interact with an encounter with base OD late in the game. Now, you can see that they're already starting to spread out. And there are guys using our vaults to get over the trucks. Here's a guy perching on traversal that's about to hit me. We have another guy use this car to jump over me, or to use a jump to get over the car. And guys are really spread out now. And I have to go through a lot of effort to avoid getting mobbed as soon as I come back down to the ground. And this is great because this really encourages our kind of core gameplay of traversing and fighting at the same time. Now, another thing to notice is that as I get up on top of this roof, I'm going to come down, and you'll be able to see clue waiting working because I'll have a big clump of guys after me who all take kind of different paths down off of the roof. Here they all come. And another thing to notice is that I really start fighting back now, and these guys go down pretty easily, but about here I've taken out about a quarter to a third of their number, but their ability to chase me and to kind of force me to keep reacting, to keep improvising, like it stays high. And a good side effect of having enemies that are this aggressive or this capable of chasing the player is that we don't really have the problem at the end of an encounter where the player needs to hunt down kind of the one last straggler. Everything comes to the player, and the fight kind of just wraps up when it feels like it, or feels like it should. So let's move on to some of the problems that we faced with ranged enemies. These are our three kind of core shooter classes. The guy on the left, we call the blower. He lobs.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there in the video. Of course, you can watch more of it if you like. I've got the link in the slide notes, lecture notes. And by the way, that game was Sunset Overdrive that we're looking at. If you didn't recognize it, so take these off. So in that game, we saw a lot of sort of interesting issues that they encountered to deal with this group movement. So the fact that we have a group in this game is really because they all have the same goal. But otherwise, they are largely independent. I mean, there's no intelligence involved that is they're not actively or individually coordinating. Instead, it's imposed by the structure of the game logic. So, for instance, they all defer to that manager that assigns them these different arcs to approach. That was the first concept we saw, is where the group is all following the same goal, which is the player, but in order to know how to approach the player, at least when there's a line of sight, is to be assigned that arc and basically swing out, and so that allows the ability to accomplish this spreading of the enemies, not getting too close. And then when path planning became involved, you saw that their first thought was, given that they had a nav mesh available, is that they would just augment the nav mesh with additional metadata. And so you saw how in that talk they discussed adding these temporary counts or scores to the nav mesh polygons to say, like, hey, this is a really congested area, and then that would kind of that would adjust the weights in the A-star search for the agents. They would be forced to solve a different solution. But that ended up not working well because of the structure of their just the nature of the way that the different convex polygons can all perhaps meet at a point, like a triangle fan sort of scenario. So it ended up not really working well in that situation. So instead, they relied on embedding some intelligence into the maps with those nav clues. That's actually a pretty common thing in game engines for AI support, is that you might have a nav mesh that sort of represents a normal traversable area, meaning the enemies or agents can stay on foot. And then if you get to a pit to jump over, or some spikes, or just anything that's in the way, that usually coincides with a different animation to get past the obstacle, like hopping over a car, hopping over a fence. So you'd have a clue in the map. We mentioned before how sometimes you put the intelligence into the map rather than entirely in the agent. So that's basically what their nav clues are, and so those were being leveraged in a way to add this sort of temporary knowledge that there was congestion. So if there was a large group, and in this game there's often always large groups chasing the player. So if one agent is hopping over a fence in a particular spot on the fence, well, that's going to become congested in that spot temporarily. It'll quickly return back to normal, but it stays at this higher weight. So that it kind of forces the other nearby agents to go select a different location. And then in the video, they mentioned how that's not sufficient, because there are large parts of the map where there just aren't enough of these nav clues. So instead, if the A-star path planning is occurring on the nav mesh, there's going to be many agents that simultaneously are they're going to be pathing through the same route, and they also will all have the same inflection points, which will be the bends going around various obstacles. Now, this relies on using string pulling. So this could only be facilitated by the fact that they have the string pulling algorithm, as opposed to like a steering behavior, an active tightening of the path, or cleaning up of the path. So at least in this case, it would be an argument for doing string pulling as a post process on the A star return, because that allows you to more easily aggregate common inflection points. So if you've got 20 zombies and they all have determined a path to their goal, like the player position, they might be fairly spread out, but they're going to share a lot of these inflection points after you do the string pulling. So at that point, once that inflection point is identified, then a marker is placed at that common inflection point. So it's like a trigger zone. So it's determined by a distance. It looks to be a circle or a sphere, at least the way they're visualizing it in their map. So that's pretty easy to calculate whether an agent is within or not. It's just based on a distance to the center of the region. So as soon as the agent is within the radius of that trigger zone, then they're within it, or as soon as their part of their desired planned path is intersecting, then that could cause a rerouting of the path. So you can see how there's sort of a cascading effect of design decisions in terms of what strategies they could use to spread things out. And then we saw another sort of like application specific approach to dealing with when the agent hops up on the power lines and slides along. They needed a way to occasionally bring those agents up there, but that took a little bit of care, just because they wanted to bring some of the agents up, but not all of them, and find sort of the right amount of balance for that. Not to mention making sure they had animations and things were physically possible, and so on. But the end result, it looked really impressive. And again, this is a situation where the agents are really largely acting individually, and the cool results in the quality of the gameplay is more of an emergent sort of outcome. And this is true of many of the group behaviors that are short of being true formations. You have the sort of group structure, you end up getting this more emergent sort of potential there. So next up, stepping back some, we're going to look at flocking. And so this is related to like the Boyd's sort of approach. And in fact, Boyd's is probably really the starting point. Let's make sure that picture of the hound eye there from Half-Life. But yeah, so flocking, we sort of use the Boyd's algorithm as a starting point, and there could be some variations to this. This is a case, though, where we do have agents that are aware of other agents. So they're actually making measurements to one another. This is a little bit different than what we just saw in the previous video, where a lot of the separation was accomplished through a manager. So the agents weren't querying one another. Instead, they were just asking a common AI element, like this AI manager, where should I go? What sort of arc should I follow? Or performing path planning in the A-star returns, taking into account the changing weights according to those weighted inflection points and the changes to the nav clues. When we're looking, when we'll be looking at flocking in the next few slides here, we're now introducing that the agents query one another and have a very primitive sort of communication, just in that they're like reading the positions of and the velocities as well. So the minimal thing that you need in order to support flocking is to be able to move towards, amongst your group, build a move towards the centroid. That's the best way for the group to make a tighter group. But there's a problem there in that you're going to end up getting too close. There's if you just sort of blindly have agents go to the centroid without any caps on that behavior, they'll just all clump up right on that centroid. So I've got a little clip here actually of the hound eyes. Let's see if I can get this to play. By the way, the hound eyes are again from the game Half-Life, and I think my personal opinion is that the hound eye is sort of an unappreciated enemy, especially sort of depending on the way you play the game. I think a lot of people that played Half-Life sort of developed this very cautious way of moving through the levels, probably a lot to do like the danger of the head crabs, for instance. But it was very sort of slowly moving forward and picking off enemies as they were alerted to you. But the hound eyes actually had this very interesting sort of behavior. So there's some kind of interesting like state machine sort of logic involved, and they would communicate. So if a hound eye spots you, they call for others, and they will come from wherever they are in the map, doing some sort of path planning. If you don't kill them off quickly enough, they will group up together and they'll follow you like a pack of dogs. They kind of act like little bulldogs. Then if they corner you, they have sort of a sort of a formation, and they synchronize. And when they synchronize, they will do the sonic attack. And so normally if you only encounter one at a time, if you're efficient in picking them off, they might give a little small attack that does very little damage. But if you say get 5 or 6 of them all together, and then they like those 5 or 6 do the synchronized attack, then it's like an exponential increase in the damage. So it's kind of an interesting enemy. I think had some cool AI, especially for the time. So with that said, let me just show you a demonstration.
Welcome to the HEV Mark IV protective system.
Okay, so yeah, that was the hound eye. So I would love to see more similar sorts of enemies that work together and have that kind of cooperation or coordination. So now next up, we'll look at the specifics of Boids. So this is Craig Reynolds was really the pioneer of steering behaviors, at least as we've presented them so far, and so he developed the Boids algorithm based on sort of an extension of the steering behaviors, layering together the sort of individual steering behaviors, but doing it in a way that allowed for this group behavior. And so he deals with exactly the problem we just described of, all right, well, we want to move towards the centroid, or have our agent move towards the centroid of its group, but we don't want to overdo it. So we're finding a balance between going to this desired position, but at the same time of trying to find a balance between getting too close to neighbors. So that's like this avoidance force. And there's also a desired velocity component as well. And this is based on doing similar action, similar movement through the environment as your neighbors. So direction and speed are coordinated. And so we can think of this as these three key components. And so that's going to include separation, cohesion, and alignment. And so we're going to find a balance between all of these. So separation is a desire to not be too close. So you think like this ring of preferred distance, and if any other agent is within that ring, that's going to start to form an avoidance force, and these are all weighted average together. And then there's cohesion, and that is desire to be at the center of your neighbors, centroid of your neighbors. And then alignment is again the orientation, the direction of travel, so the direction component of velocity, as well as the speed component. And so, but that, as you recall, with the steering behaviors, it's not something you just immediately, you can't just set it to a value, or you're breaking the fundamentals of the steering behavior. Instead, you might identify a target position, and then you have to apply a steering force to turn the agent towards the right direction. You might not get there based on the constraints of the vehicle performance envelope. So you can only turn at so fast a rate, and you might not get there within one tick of the clock. You might have to wait over several frames. Same with speeding up or slowing down. So there's this smoothing sort of effect that is applying. And since every agent is also making these separation, cohesion, and alignment determinations, it's going to take a while for these sorts of adjustments to trickle and propagate through the entire group. So you'll see basically like a wave of change that will propagate through, just like when you see a school of fish in a nature video. Like if they're swimming towards an outcropping of coral, the leaders of the group will suddenly have an obstacle avoidance strategy employed. So they'll steer away. They don't want to hit the coral. And then all of the fish behind, they're trying to do some strategy similar to what we have here. So they don't want to run into the fish in front, so they might start to slow down. They will start to turn and match the turning and direction of the leaders in front, and then the whole thing will play out as sort of this propagating from the front of the school of fish to the back. So you get exactly those same sorts of characteristics with this implementation strategy. Now, in terms of doing this in a practical way, there is an issue of the computation. So how are you going to be able to perform this in real time? And back in 1987, when Reynolds worked on this, in fact, I believe most of these were run not in real time, but rather pre-computed for like animations and like animated movie type content. So you do want to come up with a way to do this efficiently. So you need to maybe not calculate every single Boyd against all other Boyds. If you have 200 or hundreds of agents, instead of looking at all neighbors, you might only look at a subset of the entire school of fish, or the entire group of Boyds. So you perhaps have a smaller neighborhood defined to look at. And this could be done through a spatial partitioning scheme. So we're going to divide space in ways pretty similar to our discussions of discretized space for path planning. Very similar sorts of strategies we would employ here. And depending on whether these Boyds move in 2D or 3D, we could have like a quad tree or an octree, perhaps, or just not be a hierarchy, but just a lattice, a grid lattice type of structure, either 2D or 3D approach. But otherwise, you would end up, if you have no way of performing this and comparing everything, then there's going to be quite a load in terms of computation comparing against all the neighbors. Now, additionally, as these calculations are made, whether you have a spatial partitioning scheme or not for identifying a neighborhood, you can take advantage of caching. And this is the situation because for any two Boyds that are in a neighborhood, so like Boyd A and Boyd B, if Boyd A is measuring separation distance with Boyd B, that's the same distance that you get in the opposite direction, like from the perspective of Boyd B. So we might want to come up with a strategy to cache these values, rather than expensive like square root computations, especially. So it can be valuable to cache these. You can get a noticeable improvement in performance. So if we were to use the brute force method, so for n Boyds total in our group, doing no sort of neighborhood determination, this is going to be big O n squared to do so. But we would really probably want to avoid that if we can, especially if we have a large group. So in that situation, we could make like a bin lattice. This is very similar to a grid lattice. The bin lattice, it just keeps some sort of list-like structure per cell or per bin. This is updated from tick to tick of the simulation. So every time you do your next frame update, you track the movement of Boyds and reassign them as they move from one to the next. And so if you imagine, like in the 3D case, we could just divide space up into this 3D grid structure. And then we could have an initial bootstrapping process where we say, okay, well, based on the positions of all the Boyds, we'll say like, okay, there's 3 Boyds in this cell, and there's 5 in this one, and 2 in this, and so on. And so you have all of these different lattice bins that have some number of Boyds in them. And then the Boyds, if you want to determine the neighborhood of a Boyd, you say, well, what bin do you belong to? And so that's going to have a few Boyds in it, perhaps. And so, okay, well, that's some of your neighborhood. And then, well, what about the cell directly above you, and the one directly below, and the one in front and back and left and right, and then all the diagonal corners as well? Now, this is a case where you generally want to also include the diagonals with a bin lattice. And that's because, well, what if you happen to have an agent or a Boyd in a bin and they're already really close to a corner? So you really want that 8-way connectivity, because you could have Boyds that are very close to you in the diagonals. In the case, again, near a corner, and so this is generally done with all direction connectivity, whether you've got the 2D or the 3D case. So both the axis aligned directions as well as the diagonals, and so that defines your neighborhood. And so that's going to be all of the voids you find in all of those bins in the neighborhood will be used in determination of the separation and cohesion and so on. So that's going to really simplify the overall load on the system if you can employ this. Now, there is a bit of overhead because when you finally decide where your void is going and how far it goes in the frame update, occasionally it's going to cross a boundary from one bin to the next. And then when you cross that boundary, you need to make sure that you actually update, remove it from its current bin, and then reassign it to this new bin. And you generally want the resolution of the bin lattice to be such that you never move more than like one cell or one neighboring cell at a time. But yeah, so this we get to big O n times k, and this is based on the number of surrounding bins to consider. So if you were moving really fast where you could traverse more than one cell at a time, in that case, you're going to have to increase your neighborhood to more than just adjacent cells. So that's why you tend to want to size it correctly. But you also have to take into account how many voids there could be per cell, as well as the other issue to consider. All right. So for this separation, so again, this is we want to steer our agent to avoid getting too crowded. So we're trying to maintain this separation, and you want to try to avoid an issue where your agent will backtrack, for instance. So you might have like a cone of perception, perhaps. So you're only considering like agents that are in front of you, and so that can help to sort of maintain that more forward style of movement, maybe a bit more natural, to only focus on avoidance in dealing with the forward direction. And then for cohesion, we're going to steer towards the average position of the local flock mate. So again, that's going to be our neighborhood. And so you take the center of mass, so the average position of all of the voids, and then that's where your agent is being pulled to, and so they're going to want to steer towards and move towards that position. But keep in mind this is being balanced out with the separation as well. Okay, so we've got cohesion and separation, but now we also need to add this velocity and alignment. Well, actually, I'm going to show a video that someone else made, a really nice demo where they turn on and off these different elements. And so you'll see that without the alignment that we'll be adding, if you just have the separation and the cohesion, what you'll get, it looks more like, I don't know, a bunch of critters all huddling around something to eat, like a bunch of ants kind of swarming to get some dessert before they've started doing their little trail back. But you really want to have this kind of purpose in this movement, and in fact, that could also be something that you could leverage in terms of gameplay. And so the alignment, what you're doing is you're steering towards the average heading, and so kind of similar to the center of mass calculation we made, we can also just calculate an average heading, and then there's a desire for the agent to align their current steering heading the same way. And again, they can only turn so fast. There's a limit to their turning rate. So whatever their goal is, they might not achieve it instantaneously. So there's this sort of damping effect as these adjustments propagate through from void to void. And here's just to recap again. So we've got the separation. We can think of this as being around a radius around the void in question. So they're seeking to separate if any are too close within that radius. And then there is alignment, where they're attempting to, at least within a neighborhood, trying to all face the same way. And you'll, if you think about like a large group of voids, even though I might compare, like, say, void A to void B for a neighborhood, they don't necessarily share the same neighbors. So node B might compare, for separation, alignment, cohesion with node C, but void A is not aware of void C, not because they're not in the same neighborhood. So you have lots of these overlapping neighborhoods, and that also sort of contributes to the way that information propagates through. So let's go up to this video I wanted to demonstrate. I'll let this play for you, and you can you'll get a good sense of the impact of each of these strategies independently, these steering strategies independently. Oops. So actually, I've got two videos here. I believe this one is from some of Craig Reynolds' very earliest work, and then I'll show you this more recent thing where they turn on and off the features. Yeah, so there's not much to that one, but interesting just to see the earliest work in the Boyd's algorithm. So next up is the video is just describing.
So here's my implementation of the Boyd's flocking simulation, which a million people have done over the years. So there's one Boyd, and it's sort of moving randomly, and it's avoiding some obstacles, but what gets really interesting is when we put a lot together, they behave like a flock of birds or fish or whatever you want. And they do this with a couple of different rules that when combined together in a group, you get this really interesting sort of emergent behavior, if I can use a buzzword. You'll see they break up and reform and do all these interesting things just based on those rules. So the first rule here is alignment, and I'll just put a bunch of guys out here for fun. So what each Boyd does is it looks to its neighbors, its friends, in kind of a small radius, maybe about 2 or 3 body lengths as long as they are now, and it averages the position of all of its friends' headings, right, the direction that they're facing. and it moves a little bit towards that direction. So if all of its friends are looking to the left, it turns a little bit towards the left. And every Boyd does that for every other Boyd that's in that little radius of its friends group. So if I turn that off, you'll see they just kind of go everywhere. They don't really have a reason to go in any one direction or another. Now there's some other rules. Obviously you can see they like to be near each other. And that's the second rule. There's a cohesion rule. They take that same grouping, that same radius around themselves of friends, and average their positions. They say, okay, for all the Boyds around me, roughly where's the center of all of them? And then they seek towards that a little bit. So there's also a balancing force against that. If they get too close to all the other Boyds that are near them, they back away, they avoid crowding. So you can see these look pretty realistic to maybe little fish swimming around. They like to be near each other, but not so near. But because they don't care about what direction they're facing right now, since I've turned off alignment, they just kind of flit around. And as soon as I turn that back on, suddenly it looks like they have a purpose. They're swimming fast, you know. You can even see that group just reformed with another group. So those are the three rules, and I can turn these things off at will here. If we turn off crowding rule, they'll get really, really close together. They want to be near each other, and they want to copy each other's heading. So they formed into just a line. If I turn that back on, they'll puff back out. And there's some other stuff going on here. They have, you know, they have some noise. If I turn off the noise, they're pretty smooth, and if I turn it back on, you can see them kind of jiggle. So if I turn off all of the rules here, now they're fully random and they don't care about each other at all. If I turn off the noise, they just kind of drift. They still care about getting away from the barriers here on the edge. And in fact, I can come in here and turn these rules back on and lay down a bunch of barriers for them to avoid, and lay down a bunch more Boyds, and you'll see lots of interesting stuff happen. They avoid areas, stick back together, do all sorts of stuff. So if you want to download and play with this, it's on my GitHub, linked here or in the description.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good intuition on how the Boyd's algorithm works, and as you saw, it can be pretty effective. Certainly is fun to play around with, and it can add a lot to certain situations in games, like the birds and fish type scenarios. So next up, we're going to start to think about formations. So we've had about the most limited sort of coordination that we could have so far, but how might we go about introducing these more complicated scenarios of movement? And so, and just in terms of terminology, we're going to be thinking about units, which that's single agent groups where we have collections of units, but a more relaxed form of more relaxed than a formation, which is a group, but a group that has position assignments. So each group member has a role to play spatially. And so I've got another little video here where I'm going to just show some features. This is from not my work, but someone else that had been developing some like libraries for Unity, doing different sort of formations. Sorry. So this example, we have a formation. It's very simple. just trying to maintain a line. But you can see that there's different scenarios that challenge the formation. Units that can't maintain that structure. But also another interesting thing is that it's an oriented formation. So the direction of travel defines the orientation and layout ultimately. So we have this wheeling or rotating of the formation that's involved. And so we saw different types of obstacles. We saw obstacles that forced the individual units to have to spread out or split. And then we saw like a pinch point walking through, say, like a canyon, squeezing together. And so those are the sorts of challenges that you face if you're trying to implement this kind of formation movement. Here's another example. And so here we have some pretty complicated formations involved, more like a some battle long ago, where it was highly regimented sort of battle formations. So that also demonstrated changing between formations, and so that there's a challenge of how do you do that effectively? How do you move from one configuration to the next? And also another example of dealing with obstacles. So definitely some tricky issues to deal with once you start having this higher level of coordination between units. So in terms of implementation strategies, you can think about having individual agents that are planning and moving all on their own. So they make their own decisions, but they're sharing a common goal. And so that's the sort of coordination we saw at the beginning of this lecture is that, largely moving independently. Well, we did see a few cases where of indirect coordination, like the ARC manager that was assigning to the zombies the different paths to go, and then we've also seen a little bit of individuals making these kind of complementary decisions, so some sort of shared information. And certainly with the Boids, there is a primitive sort of sharing, but it is effective just to query and respond to the state of other agents. And then there's also the possibility that you could have your groups that are making decisions as a whole. So this is where some notion of a group where we have some AI entity, probably not something you see, or it could be. You could actually assign this sort of more important or higher level decision making could be assigned to a single unit. And that can make sense in some games, like you say you have a general or a hero or something. Then that unit could be making decisions, and the rest are listening to the decisions. So in terms of moving as a group, if you do this in an independent sort of way, you have agents that are making a determination of the shortest distance to the target. That can often result in a traffic jam because you can have units that are attempting to occupy the same locations. And so they might all be trying to land on the same location at the end, but even during the traversal, they're all going to be aiming for the same inflection points. And you know, we've seen exactly that issue earlier in the talk, and some of the strategies for adding some smarts to the world or adjustments to A star as well in order to sort of deal with that. So if you are running into these sorts of problems with these traffic jams, you're going to have agents that might stop. You might have if everyone's working totally independently, every agent, then you could end up with agents trying to plan around their group members, and it might not be the most effective. The most effective approach. You could end up with kind of a vicious cycle. So even if agents have the ability to be flexible or respond to changing conditions, like, okay, well, there's something in my way, whether that's an agent or not, something in the way, and then they choose to go around, that might not always be the best strategy. Maybe there's some level of cooperation that could have been more effective, or just waiting a moment, and then things could have worked out better. So one's a strategy that involving like some coordination is that we could have, say, a single calculation made for movement. So this notion of a group, we can say, where it is that our group is, maybe defined by their current centroid. And then we pat that, so we say that's where the group is. And then we could perform path planning from that spot to a destination. And then the actual position to move to is an offset from that centroid. So each agent is aware of their offset from the centroid at the start, and then they try to maintain that same offset at as they move. And so you need some notion of the path progressing. So what are the operators that we're performing on our state space? The agents will always, they need to be able to check against this moving centroid and trying to maintain this position. So all the agents are trying to move. So you've got that one plan, and then following along. But of course there's all these issues that you can run into that we saw in the previous video, the video we just watched. So obstruction, choke points, and then also occluded destinations. So you might be able to have your agents sort of maintain like a formation the whole way, but then when they get there, it's impossible to maintain. So what do? Do you err on the side of having one agent have to go to a different location, or rather do you reset where the entire group goes so that they can better create that layout? Now, so we've already seen the grid lattice before, or look at discretized space. And if you have a game with discretized space and have group style movement, that there are some nice features for like multiple agents moving about in the environment, and that's because you can very easily say that certain cells are occupied or not. So you can just kind of update the state of any given cell and or grid location. So that has a nice feature if the grid size coincides with the size of an agent, and you have like a one-to-one correspondence, so that any one cell can only hold one agent, and you move from cell to cell. That can, even though it can have a very wasteful sort of resolution in terms of the graph. In terms of the dynamics of the space, it has some nice features. So again, we can at runtime easily mark cells as being used or unused. And so if there's something in the way, then agents can just plan around, because they can easily tell that there is some occupation of the cell that would otherwise be considered. So you can there's potentially some like coordination type of approaches that you might want to take, like sending a message to a unit to say get out of the way might be a better move in some cases. So let's say it was a strategy game. If you send a group on a path and they're gonna, you have some other units that are just sitting around blocking, then you might want to have just sort of automatically recognize that and move out of the way, rather than triggering this full replanning. So it can get a bit more complicated as well, and that's really true. Like a lot of these group formation type of approaches, is that you could always consider like a different approach, or a little bit more complicated, or the context is different because of the nature of the gameplay. Like one approach might not work just because of the type of game that you're making. But as you're trying to come up with like a better or a more capable strategy for coordinated movement, you start to have the need for more data structures and some way of planning better, especially like in the sense of a timeline. So your plans that you're making, moving multiple units, and some of these might be like think in terms of like a real-time strategy. You could have separate groups that all belong to the same army that have different marching orders, and those marching orders, ideally you would want the best possible coordination between all as possible. And so in order to get that to work, we're going to need some way to kind of track through time, like planning into the future and anticipating future collisions or congestion. And so that's where things can get really tricky. And so one sort of practical impact on games is how are you going to deal with collisions between objects? So far we've really just talked about AI and the decisions related, and to a lesser degree about any sort of physics simulation. When we have, in terms of steering behaviors, we've mentioned like the performance envelope of the vehicle model for the steering behavior agents. But in terms of any sort of physical reality of our simulated space, we haven't talked as much about it. But let's say we are implementing like a real-time strategy game. There's going to be it's going to be a real challenge to get formations and group movement and so on to work, especially on arbitrary maps which might have tight canyons or pinch points and various types of obstacles, and all these units moving either in groups or formations. And so in terms of the physics of how these units interact, you probably want to have some kind of physics that disallows units from occupying the same space. And your first thought might be to do that in a very rigid sort of way, saying, well, this unit is let's say we have tanks. You'd say, well, this unit is a rectangle shape, and it's never going to intersect with this other rectangle. I'm gonna impose through a physics calculation that if this unit runs into the other, they can't continue and get closer and closer and overlap one another. It's just not going to be allowed. Now, the problem with doing so is that most of your AIs that you're not calculating, say, a guaranteed solution. Instead, you're making more of like a best effort reactive sort of agent. Sometimes it's going to make mistakes. The same way that we saw in the last lecture, the OpenSteer, sometimes the agents would say cross into an obstacle. They just go right over it. There's no physics imposed in the OpenSteer demos. So it would cross over. If that was in a real game, you would have like a collision. So your rigid body physics simulation would give you a collision. And so if you're making like a real-time strategy game and you have a collision, you could impose it as a very hard sort of constraint. But in practice, you're going to find that by being so rigid in your collision detection, you're just going to end up with units getting stuck. So instead, what you probably want to do is soften the constraints and make the collision detection. Maybe there is some element of hard detection size, but then you're going to have like a softer collision detection, and so some of this could be like more of like an avoidance force. So you might have agents that visually look like they occupy some size, but in reality, there is a soft separation that's slightly larger than the unit. But also often that soft radius will actually continue down well within the visual limits as well. And it can vary, depending on how the quality of the AI, how effective it is at avoiding getting stuck and so on. This might be less obvious, I guess, but yeah. So being able to sort of have these two notions, this will allow, in worst case, maybe units to get in really tight, even to the point of not being very visually appealing. Also, potentially maybe recognizing collisions early before that they're actually touching. This would be kind of similar to having in video game physics. Many solutions have a skin width. So you have like a hard constraint on a rigid body, but then there's this additional skin width, and it has some nice properties just for basic physics outside of any sort of AI. All right, but so once you've established this means of collision detection, we could also think about not just real-time collision detection, but what about collisions in the future? And so this is where things can get a little tricky in terms of very complicated sort of planning. So if we've got like a real-time strategy and we want to deal with planning out paths that formations and groups are maintaining and traversing the environment, and they could be crossing paths and so on. We could have some defined collision detection, but so how do we detect collisions in the future? So what we could do is we could make a movement line. And so a movement line is a bit like a path that any of the paths that we've considered before for path planning. In fact, it could have started with path planning, and then we're going to extend the path with additional metadata, tracking not just like say after doing string pulling you would say have inflection points, but instead we're going to we're going to need to have samples along the path that reflect points in time, like a timeline. So you might have a long straight path, and if all you needed the path was for path planning, long straight lines would be great. But we need additional information. So we're actually going to like subdivide these long paths based on some temporal sampling. And so at each of those points, we can say, all right, well, at future t some value, this unit is going to be here. And so you could have lots of these movement lines, and they're all overlapping. And even if you have intersections of the path, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because you also have to consider like the moment in time. Now, the resolution of these samples could cause problems, because if you compare one movement line to another, you might skip over or not have any intersections. So if you just had every couple seconds a new mark on the map, you might not necessarily have it intersect with other things. And so you really need to have some way of connecting the dots, temporal sample to temporal sample. And so this would generally be done with like a raycast or some similar geometry that you could test for intersections. But then if you do have intersections, you also have to figure out like the time comparison. So you've got a t-value from one movement location to the next, and so if that intersects with another line, you could say, well, does that intersection matter? And so you could check to see if the schedule of the two are similar enough at that point of intersection. And so that allows you to identify problems, or if something is occupied, and it helps you deal with the situation that your space discretization might not provide this easily for you the way that like a grid lattice would. So a grid lattice, we could just start adding metadata, straight to the grid for this purpose. But if we've got, say, a nav mesh or a path network, then we start to need to be able to think about these movement lines as providing this ability. But yeah, so if you can represent units in this fashion, you can then start to consider where there might be problems in the future, and then go ahead and plan accordingly. So you have an intersection and a path, then you could go ahead and replan. So this is fairly similar to like the metadata for the zombies, and trying to to keep them spreading out in the video that we watched earlier. So how you might be able to do that. But this can also include additional plan information for a unit. So your plan might be to have your unit slow down, like maybe they don't go full speed. And so there could actually be cues in the movement line to capture this information. So you would say, all right, you slow down as you follow this movement line, slow down at these points, and then speed back up here. And so as there's these refinements that are occurring to this coordinated plan, you can embed that knowledge in these unit lines. Now, in terms of how do you deal with collisions, if you are detecting collisions, what do you do? And so the simplest approach is just anytime there's a problem with a path, you just recompute it. But again, when we're talking about large groups of units or formations, you run the risk of reaching a vicious cycle where lots of units are just constantly recomputing a star. And if some units start doing it, they're getting in the way of other units, and it's just, again, a vicious cycle. and it's going to hit your frame rate and ruin your gaming experience. So what you might rather do is don't search a new path at each collision. Instead, this is assuming these are all units like on the same team. So therefore, it's desirable for coordination, like in a real-time strategy. If it's all your army, you can have a priority structure where higher priority items or units, they get to maintain movement without any sort of replanning. They have authority. And then lower priority agents, they get out of the way. And so I think an example here, if we're sticking with a real-time strategy scenario, you might have the big, heavy mega tank, like the really expensive, slow-moving unit that doesn't turn very well. Well, it makes sense that unit, one, being so powerful and important strategically, that it just maintains course. And if you have some small scout units or infantry, well, they need to get out of the way. So kind of similar to the rules of the ocean. The big ships get to maintain their course, and all the smaller ships get out of the way, kind of approach. And so that can work well. And there have also been approaches at using some higher order decision making, such as case-based reasoning. This is a topic we'll cover later. But just consider it like recognizing a common scenario and already knowing a solution that works well through like a caching scheme. So you have like a dictionary that you look up a scenario. So you have some way that you are sampling from the current scenario. You go look up old similar situations before, and well, what worked last time? And so that's the like at a high level how that might work. So in terms of resolving, if we have these unit lines and we see that these collisions are going to occur in the future, or even if this is a real-time sort of decision-making or collision resolution. So we see that this is a pending problem. So we want to favor our high priority agents over the low priority. Then next up, you might favor, well, what's moving versus non-moving. So again, let's say we have a cluttered map in our real-time strategy. You've got maybe some units that are just sitting around guarding the base, and you're sending this carefully orchestrated attack on your enemy base. You don't want anything to slow them down or mess up your timing. And you may have forgotten to get the non-moving units out of the way. So it'd be nice if you send your attack force, and they're marching along, any of your own units that are non-moving, they would be lower priority. And so they are then given a new task. They just automatically triggered is a movement or a path planning to get out of the way. And so again, this would be like based on analyzing the movement lines and detecting this future collision, and then that would trigger this generation of the correction to move those non-moving units out of the way. And in terms of things that like lower priority units would have to do, to get out of the way, they could either generally do one of two things. One is they turn around, go or move out of the area. But the other is that if they themselves are moving, they will change speed, possibly stopping and just pausing, waiting for the higher priority units to move first. And so if you have this sort of strategy, so we're coupling the movement line, which again is like a timeline, with this sort of priority scheme, when we have these anticipations of collisions, then this gives us a good way to deal with those problems. Giant slow-moving units are going to be high priority. You really have to think also about the gameplay. So more powerful units, if it's more important strategically, certainly those will tend to have a higher priority. If they're important to game objectives or story, like if it's a hero, not just some anonymous grunt, but something important to the game, a leader, and then also the sort of situational aspects like the moving versus not moving units. We want the not moving. Generally, in terms of gameplay, it makes sense for them to get out of the way. And then you might have some context provided by objectives. So if a unit is dealing with an important objective, that might temporarily bump up the priority. All right, so in terms of our distinction between groups and formations. So groups will say, when we have a defined group and they're all moving together, they need to stay together. And so that means that all the units move at the same speed. So for, say, implementing a real-time strategy game, it would be dangerous if, say, we've done dragged our mouse cursor over a group and had them move across the map, and then we had like some really fast scout units just race ahead at full speed. Scouts tend to be the faster units. And then you might have some slow lumbering units or units that can't defend themselves, like some kind of harvester unit. And so there'd be a danger of just letting them all sort of go off on their own. Instead, we want to sort of maintain the group and movement. And so this is a straightforward thing to do. We just will impose a speed limit based on whoever's the slowest. And we might have to do some additional consideration of turning rate as well. So if there's turning involved and there's a big difference in turning, that could have an impact as well that you might have to address. So one strategy that you might be able to take with a group is to have, again, movement that's not everyone moving individually, but where we have a group structure involved. So once the group is formed, it initiates this new agent entity, like kind of a on-demand entity that is the group. It's often you don't see it, but it would just exist in terms of in memory of your computer. And so it thinks about the group moving as this one cohesive sort of entity, but you can occasionally have it as part of the game. So again, as like a hero or commander unit in the game, that can be effective. And so if you have this sort of notion of a group, then you do the path planning only for the leader or only for consideration of this abstract group, and then all the units move towards that position, just following along, just chasing that position or leader unit. But then you can get more advanced. So we already mentioned before having the offset position from the leader. And then, so that could just be regardless of direction. So you always maintain that relative position. Or you could, if you want to get really fancy, you could have the rotating or wheeling. And so that is assumed that the orientation is always with a forward vector, the current movement of the leader. So say if the leader turns, those that are way off to his sides, they're going to have to really hurry up to get to their positions, or the leader's going to have to really slow down and wait, because you can imagine, those that are way off to the sides, the turning would impose impossible velocities for them. So the wheeling really can introduce some challenges. And then, you say it's just some basic, simple steering behaviors in this sort of mode. You're just following the leader or that offset position. And that works well until there is a substantial block or getting stuck in a local minima kind of situation. And that might initiate a path plan for an individual unit in addition to whatever the group has done. But ultimately, rather than planning all the way to the goal all alone, their plan is to just get back to line of sight with the leader. And once that happens, then they can go back to their old strategy. Now, you may also want some level of communication where those units that got stuck and had a path plan let the leader know, or this abstract group. But in any case, let that AI agent entity know that they're stragglers and to slow down and let them catch up again. So formations, this is where we have a layout. And when you do have a formation, we usually are introducing some additional states to the basic group behavior. And that is that you can have a situation where the formation is forming, formed, or broken. And then only a formed formation can move. And so the idea here is that you may, in some cases, need to break the formation either in terms of gameplay, like you maybe could have some units scattered and they have an assigned formation, and so you hit a hotkey and they all rush to the formation, or it could be because they're forming and breaking as they deal with challenges in the environment or combat and so on. So they might have a situation that breaks them up, and then they have to reform in order to move again. So formation, the forming side of formations is tricky, and that's because a lot of times you have a formations that are really tightly packed. So, especially like military, which is probably the most common situation where you have a formation in a game. So this military sort of structure that you would potentially have with these multiple agents, think about how everyone gets into position and how to do so efficiently. There's probably like an ordering of setting up that works better than others. And so you really should come up with a strategy that involves forming at the middle and working the way out. So agents that are in the middle would be assigned to go to their positions first, and then you add more and more agents. So say, okay, now it's your turn. You go to your spot, and so on. And as you do this, it might vary each time as well, exactly the specifics. So even though you're starting at the middle, well, which of the middle units or which of the next layer as you work your way out. And so you might want to have some kind of heuristic that's looking for the least collisions or least distance. Maybe you can do a raycast. So you say, well, these agents, they're up next. They're, the next layer building up from the middle. And so of the 10 total positions, 3 of them can do a raycast and not hit anything. And so you'll pick the first one that's the closest of the 3, and then the second and the third. And then once you've exhausted all of them, now you check for new raycasts. And since they just moved, probably a few more agents now can raycast safely. And then you maybe as you sort of diminish those numbers that need to get into position, maybe there's like a couple that actually need to do A-star or path planning because there's such a big group or obstacles in the way. They need to do a little bit more complicated or expensive sort of movement. You can also incorporate the unit priority. Again, if you have the big, powerful tank that's slow and lumbering, that would probably make sense to move them first or minimize their movement overall. So this figure here, this I think gives a good idea of what could happen. So if we have a target formation that is like a 3x3, very tightly formed grid kind of formation layout, you could end up where all the positions on the outside get exactly where they need to go, and there's no room to go in. And so instead, you would want to work again from the middle outwards. And if you don't, even if you have the ability, like let's say in this case 4 and 6 could get out of the way for 9, that'd be a little bit of wasted effort, maybe not so bad. But if this was a very large group and you made no effort to plan this, you could end up with a vicious cycle where like the 4 and the 6 getting out of the way are bumping into other units on an even outer layer, and so you just could end up where all the units are kind of in a infinite loop of vicious cycle, getting out of the way and getting into the way of some new units. And here is a look at wheeling and orienting. So if the at the starting point, if the direction of travel is straight down and we're trying to maintain, straight across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say we turn to, I guess, from their perspective and going down, they would turn left. So if they start to turn left, this is what I mentioned before about it creating a problem, because you have that, see the outer lane there for the 1, how much longer the path is to swing around relative to the 5. So the 5 can easily make that position, but the 1 has that impossible to maintain kind of rate for the turn. So this is a situation where you would often break formation. So the wheeling has been initiated. So they break formation. Instead, each unit goes to kind of an individual strategy of getting to where they need to be. And units hold. So they get to their position and they just wait. So they're waiting for the formation to reform. And so that's shows the benefits of that sort of state machine logic of formations, where you can be forming, formed, or breaking. So yeah, that is a way to deal with wheeling. And just to reiterate, when you trying to maintain groups or formations and want them to stay together, you have to be aware of the fastest that the slowest unit can go in order to be able to have a realistic formation. So otherwise you're just going to have everyone planning and going with their own individual movement. And let's see, I think we already covered the issues with the turning and the wheeling. Now, formations with obstacles, these are more situations where you might have braking, but in this case, it could be valuable to break a formation, but not do so in a way that's just completely, like all or nothing. Instead, you could form a new formation that's a subformation. So you say, well, these two units are still close and still roughly in their relative formation position. So let's just make a subformation of them while they split briefly. And so this is a fairly complicated approach, but the complexity could be worthwhile in like a really really detail-oriented strategy game where the maintaining of a formation would be critical to the gameplay. So rather than just say, oh well, the units can't be in a formation anymore. So we're just totally broken and just wait and reform on the other side. Instead, this would minimize the recovery and also maintain the military sort of capability. Now, if you're going through a pinch point, it's possible the units can still fit. And so in those cases, you might want to first try a scaling of the formation. So the formation manager could say, all right, it looks like they don't fit. They don't, in terms of analyzing like the nav mesh, this formation geometric shape does not fit. So then you could say, all right, well, let's apply a scaling to make them fit. And then if that scaling was applied, you could then analyze the individual units and say, are these units in a valid position, meaning that they aren't breaking hard constraints. If they're breaking soft constraints, it may be okay. But if they're breaking hard constraints, then you would just say, okay, we'll break formation completely and go single file or in a row of 2 or 3, and so on. But if the scaling can occur and it can fit, then you can go with it. And so sort of similar to our discussion with just general groups, we can also have a hierarchy for the path planning problem with the formation, and you might even do so in a way that's sort of where you're scaling the complexity of your environment as well. So you're planning for the formation or the group, not the individual units. But we're not going to compare that to like the entire map or the entire nav mesh. Maybe we have a simplified version that works with a larger size. So, a formation you could think of as like a single giant unit. And then if you do that, you might ignore small obstacles. And that's because in reality, your formation has this fluidity to it. It could break apart and reform and probably still fit through areas. So you can have that lower resolution path planning exist, just ignoring smaller obstacles. And that's going to improve like computational complexity. But also, it works with this notion of a formation that we have. And then we can work our way down to lower level sort of as needed. So if we enter a situation where the formation has to break, which might happen because we ignored those the smaller obstacles, then we're doing path planning on this different hierarchical level and a different resolution of the world. And then we just reform the formation on the other side of whatever that challenging area of the formation is. And in terms of how we might manage this, like computationally and with data structures, is that we're maintaining the high level path. We have a concept of a path stack. So we're maintaining the high level path strategy, but we encounter this issue that requires this lower level, say, breaking up the formation into subformations and each moving. So in those cases, we still cache or preserve the high level strategy that we were following, but now we push onto the stack this lower level strategy and follow that until it's complete, and then it pops off the stack, and then we're back to the high level again with the reformed formation. And so this is one way that we can sort of deal with that. And this can kind of give an idea of what might be involved. So the high level, we have say a unit that's just following its relative offset to the hero or leader or abstract notion of the group moving as a whole, like a centroid. And then we hit some issue, and So we divert from the high level path and employ the low level strategy. We do this avoidance path planning just briefly to get back to where we need to be around the obstacle, and then go back to the high level strategy again. So just to wrap things up, we have this notion of high level and low level pathing to deal with our groups and behaviors, and so the high level will be the thinking of just the entire group moving. And there's different ways that, in terms of actually synchronizing the individual units to the high level plan, that we can employ, whether it's just chasing the leader or trying to maintain this relative offset. And we can play around with whether the logic, the agent logic for our group or formation is hidden, or is it like embedded in one of the agents as like a leader. And then as problems crop up, we will have to somehow relax our constraint of our group or formation. So in case of formation, we might actually break the formation, its formation's being stateful, and then reform after this lower level strategy is dealt with. Sort of embrace the fact that units will overlap. You'll maybe have some preferred separation or physical constraint, but that'll be soft, and then you're going to have something smaller that is the hard constraint. And in practice, you're probably not going to be able to push the hard constraint to perfect fidelity, where someone playing your game will never see one tank graphically intrude on the other. You're probably going to see that, and if you played a lot of RTS type games, you've probably seen overlap before. Understand time and the update loop, but also be prepared to think about time in the future in the form of like a movement line as well. A lot of the more advanced strategies will involve that. So I guess to wrap things up, when you have this sort of group movement, especially when you get into the more elaborate strategies like formations that you see in real-time strategy games often, things get a good bit more complicated and are more error-prone in terms of unit movement and the formation movement. So there's real art to it, and trial and error and tuning things and getting it right. And yes, it's I think a genre that has probably employed some of the most advanced AI techniques, at least related to path planning and unit movement, just because of the complexities of the genre. All right, so we'll stop there, and I'll see you next time.